Well, good morning, folks. Welcome back to Threes In. Um, 1987, probably around late August. I would think that'd be about the timing, early September, maybe. I just wasn't feeling well. I wasn't feeling well spiritually. I wasn't feeling well emotionally. Physically, things just weren't on even keel and so forth. So I called my flight surgeon. I called the flight surgeon, Colonel John Sandrew, and asked if I could come by and talk to him. He said, absolutely, sure, come on over. He said, we'll fit you in. I said, well, sir, I would like to talk with you more in an informal setting than anything else. He said, why don't you come by the house around 5:15? And I said, great. So around 5:15, I swung by his house and knocked on the door. He came to the door. He said, hey, Bob. He said, would you like a beer? And I said, that's one of the things I'd like to talk with you about. He says, oh, okay. So I, we walked out in the yard and sat down underneath a pecan tree. He had a little bench there. And I began to tell him how I was feeling, how I was struggling emotionally and spiritually and physically with respect to my service in the Air Force. I told him I just wasn't having fun anymore. The spark was gone, if you will. And so we talked a little bit about that, about specifics. And then I mentioned to him about the only relief I get is through beer. I said, when I go home, I said, I usually finish the evening with a six pack. And then on weekends, I really push it up. But I said, that's kind of my life. It's kind of the cycle I've fallen into. And I said, I am so fortunate, and I know it. I'm doing what I wanted to do when I was 4, 5, 6 years old. I said, I'm flying these Air Force jets. And I said, usually I was having a ball at it, but of late with things the way they were, just wasn't fun anymore. So we chatted a bit, and then he looked at me and he said, well, Bob, he says, why don't you just quit? So I thought to myself, well, he's got a point. I said, I'm within a year of retirement, and maybe it's time I went and did something else. So I talked it over with my wife, and around early October, I contacted the wing commander, great guy, Nick Keogh, and I asked if I could come and see him. And as it turned out, we actually met up down in the squadron, sat down in the flight commander's office, and I told him what my intentions were. And he was very understanding with respect to it all, and that started things in motion for my retirement. So in July 1988, I retired. Now, for this story to mean something to you, in 1994, I called up Northwest Airlines, who I was flying for, and I asked them for help with a problem I thought I had, alcoholism. Now, I left myself an out. I said, I think I might be an alcoholic. There are two things there, I think and I might. I wasn't quite sure whether I wanted to give it up or not, although I knew I did. But I gave myself two escape avenues in case I was wrong. Well, as it turns out, I went up for assessment and I was spot on. So they kept me. More on that maybe in another video. But anyway, I really got into AA and I got into my recovery and I enjoyed it. I have enjoyed it. I don't think I'd be here if I hadn't. At any rate, this one day I was coming home from a meeting. It was a nice sunny day and I was just feeling great to be alive. And I replayed that tape in my mind about going over to John's house. And so I'm sitting there thinking about how we discussed the facets of my life to include my Air Force experience and my love of beer. And then I'm driving along and I think to myself, when he mentioned, why don't you quit? I wonder if he was talking about quit drinking or quit the Air Force. Doh. So anyway, I got home and I've always prided myself on being a decent investigator. I spent 5 years investigating aircraft accidents. So it wasn't long before I found John, and I found his phone number, and I called him up, introduced myself, and I said, "Hey, John, I have a question I need to ask you." He said, "What's that?" I said, "Do you remember that conversation we had?" And he said, "Yeah." He says, "I remember very distinctly." I said, "When you suggested that I quit," I said, "did you mean quit the Air Force or quit drinking?" He said, "Quit drinking, you dumbass." So I just sat there and shook my head. Quit drinking. That's probably the last thing I would have thought of at that time. But at any rate, things worked out the way they were supposed to work out. And I've never regretted a moment of it. It was time for me to go and do something else. And that worked out fine. As it turned out, it was through Northwest Airlines. I'm so grateful for giving me the attitude to get sober so I could sit here and tell you these wonderful stories today. Quit drinking or quit the Air Force. Our minds are just wired a little different than most people's. And there you see it. Take care, guys. Good to see you.